Hey guys, welcome to the wonderful time in between Christmas and New Year's where we don't really know what day it is. We're spending most of our time in a food coma and we have no idea how much cheese we've actually eaten in the last week. And if you're anything like me, you might find this to be a good time to sort of chill out and watch some YouTube videos and maybe do some boat shopping. If you've been sailboat shopping at all in the last year or so, you know the market did a lot like the housing market did. It went way, way up, and then it came back down, and we're finally now back in sort of a place that you might actually be able to buy something. And in that buying process, you may have some things that the boat can or cannot be, and that limits you to a couple of very specific boats that you're sort of shopping for. But this week, in the Christmas spirit, we're going to try to widen your horizons a little bit and broaden your palette if we can, and get you looking at some different boats, like you did with the different cheeses. This week on Everything You Need to Know, mistakes you shouldn't make when you're boat shopping. The first mistake we're going to talk about today is keel choice, and some people don't give that much thought, but many boat buyers swear up and down that they will only have a boat with an encapsulated keel, and that paints them into a corner when they're shopping. Now you can only buy boats like Island Packets and some Gulf Stars, Albergs and Cape Dories, things like that, basically all of the full keel boats. But why is that, and why should you be insisting on an encapsulated keel over a bolt-on keel? What's the difference? Okay, so encapsulated means when they built the sailboat hull, the keel was part of the mold. They do the whole hull with the keel as one mold, but the keel is hollow when they first build it. Then they fill the hollow keel from above before they put the deck on. A bolt-on keel, on the other hand, is literally just bolted onto the hull after the fact. They basically mold the whole hull by itself, and in some cases, the whole hull mold also has a little stub on the bottom where they're going to bolt the keel later. And then the keel simply bolts onto the hull. When there's no keel stub, it bolts onto a flat spot on the bottom of the hull. The flat spot thing, Beneteau does that a lot. Both of those keels, of course, have some upsides and some downsides. The encapsulated keel is really amazing because they pour the weight into it and then they can glass over the top of it for you. And as the owner, you never really have to think about it again. The ballast is sort of all sealed up from the outside and from the inside, and there's no keel bolts to inspect, and literally nothing to really think about ever again, hopefully. Some problems do stem from this approach, however. For example, what did they use for ballast? Some manufacturers will use chunks of lead or chunks of cast iron. Some even just use scrap metal that they find laying around. It just has to be heavy, really. But they don't want the mold inside the keel to have large air pockets. That's dangerous. So then they have to pour something in there to fill in all the spots around those chunks of ballast that they put in. And sometimes they pour in epoxy, which is great. But sometimes they even use concrete. And the inside of the keel becomes this hodgepodge of who knows what, and usually the owner will never really have any way of finding out or knowing what's in there, hopefully. And normally, that's just fine. For decades, that's just fine. It's lots of weight, it's all sealed up, and you never have to think about it until it breaks. One of the downsides to this encapsulated keel is what to do after a really hard grounding or a collision with an object where it damages the keel. It can be a lot harder to repair the keel simply because of the way it's made, and to a large extent, the quality of how it's made. That becomes apparent when you have to fix it. Owners have found themselves trying to glass over large chunks of concrete, and in some very bad cases, finding everything in the encapsulated keel is now just buckets of rust. And I mean buckets of rust. People have hauled up buckets of the old keel weight, whether it was lead or cast iron, and it's because water was intruding into the keel mold for decades, and nobody ever knew it because it's sort of all sealed up. Owners have managed to bucket out all the rusty bits and replace them with new ballast, but it's very, very hard to do, and it is an expensive endeavor. And also, and this is a big one for some people as a downside to these keels, by design, they have to be very big, because you have to pour all the ballast into them, and they're very wide, so the boat gets a lot more wetted surface on the outside underwater. which means it's slower. For hydrodynamic performance, meaning how fast the boat can actually travel through the water, you want the ballast weight to be heavy and very, very low under the waterline and as little wetted surface as possible. But these encapsulated keels make that almost impossible by their design. The chunks of lead or iron mixed in with the concrete or epoxy means the weight might be all over the place, and the sheer size of these keels simply means that there's a whole lot of drag because of all the wetted surface as it travels through the water, making it slower. Now, those downsides aren't to say that these keels are bad. They aren't. They're very, very, very good at big ocean crossings, big passages. They're tough as nails. The weight and size of the keel makes them the most comfortable boats at sea or in an anchorage if it gets choppy. And they do tend to be a shallower draft because they're much bigger. They don't have to go as deep. So you can get into more anchorages, which is nice and potentially safer if you're hiding from hurricanes or something. Okay, so what about bolt-on keels then? What's the problem? How do they work? So with a bolt-on keel, once the hull mold is complete, a keel is then molded separate from the boat. And that's done out of solid lead in most cases. It doesn't need to be encased in fiberglass. This means that there's much less chance of voids in the construction where water and air can live and cause problems and need to be filled with concrete or epoxy. Because the keel is its own self-sustaining structure and it doesn't need to live in a giant fiberglass mold, the keel can be thinner and smaller, so less wetted surface, and it can be designed in a more hydrodynamically friendly way. Think about cars being put in a wind tunnel for aerodynamics, but change that to hydrodynamics. An external keel can be improved extensively to travel through the water with the highest possible efficiency, which is why you won't see very many race boats with anything but a bolted-on keel. Just makes more sense. Bolt-ons also tend to be narrow at the top, widening out at the bottom, which means the builder can get the most weight as low as possible for the best performance. Also of note, a bolt-on keel can be a lot easier to fix. You can get to it if you have a bad grounding or a chunk of the keel is broken. It can be refilled, or if the keel is so badly damaged, it can simply be removed and repaired, or removed and replaced entirely. It also means the manufacturer can give you more options when you're ordering a brand new boat because they might have 3 different styles of bolt-on keel for each hull that they make. The problem with a bolt-on keel is evident in its name. It has to be bolted onto the hull of the sailboat, which creates a possible point of failure, of course. The manufacturers mold the hull specifically with a spot on the bottom that's reinforced to accept the stresses of the keel. But over time, fiberglass hulls do fatigue, and keel bolts fatigue. You have extra maintenance because of that, so you have to make sure that the keel bolts are tightened properly over the years, not just from the factory, but you have to make sure that they're tightened over and over and over again over a long period of time because bolts do stretch. And you have to make sure the fiberglass isn't cracking around the bolts or showing signs of wear. And in Benetto's case, or anyone who does the flat bottom without the stub for the keel to bolt to, the strength behind that is derived from stringers inside the hull that sort of strengthen everything around where the keel bolts, and those have to be inspected. Another downside to a bolt-on keel is that those bolts, for maintenance purposes, have to remain exposed. So you won't be putting a 300 or 400 gallon fresh water tank in the bilge. You just can't do it. In fact, many bolt-on keel boats barely even have a bilge. Mine's only about 8 inches deep. So given all that, it may seem obvious now that an encapsulated keel is the way to go, unless you're racing and you don't want all that wetted surface. But it's not actually that simple. Tens of thousands of boats are out there right now cruising as you watch this video with bolt-on keels. And they can't all be wrong, can they? The fact is that bolt-on keel designs have gotten so good that the risk inherent with the design, with proper inspection and maintenance, is almost non-existent. There are so many bolt-ons out there with hundreds of thousands of miles on them with no problem at all. We're just that good at making them now. So why all the hate for these bolt-on keels? Why do some people absolutely refuse to go anywhere near them? I think for me it stems from 2 different things. First is the water elephant in every keel discussion room, and that's cheeky Rafiki. If you've been looking at boats or living in the sailing world for any amount of time, you've undoubtedly heard of Cheeky Rafiki. She was a Beneteau First 40 racing yacht that tragically lost its keel, and the 4 crew members aboard at the time were lost at sea in the ocean. And this has led to years and years, if not decades, of stigma around bolt-on keels. But there is a caveat. Cheeky Rafiki has, her whole life, been an ocean race boat and had many, many groundings and multiple keel repairs. Particularly, as I mentioned before, she is a Beneteau, and she's one of the ones where there was no keel stub. A lot of the molds of fiberglass boats with bolt-on keels make a stub at the bottom where the keel is going to link up to it. Beneteau on these boats didn't do that, so the keel just bolts to the flat bottom of the boat. And to absorb those stresses, it is supported by an interior stringer matrix. Think like 2x4s on the hull glassed over to make strength rates. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that basically sums it up. There's a matrix of these stringers to support the area of the flat bottom where the keel is going to bolt. And that matrix on Cheeky Rafiki had been repaired multiple times after multiple groundings. Ultimately, after the accident, there was an investigation, of course, and it was ruled that the cause of Cheeky Rafiki's keel failure was due to negligence in repair. So she had no business being out in the ocean the way she was. The other stigma against bolt-on keels, and stay with me here, this is my opinion, there seems to be a general hatred for any newer production boat. Even production boats without bolt-on keels. People just hate them. The world of sailboat opinions is vast. If you've ever gone on the internet and typed sailboat, you already know this. And most of those opinions come from the older salts that simply swear by older boat designs. Many of these older salts and their older boat designs present very good arguments for those designs, but in some cases you can hear a hint of maybe jealousy in some of them, not all of them. The newer boats give you so much more for your money, bang for buck, that some folks just hate on them because when they bought their boat in the 70s or 80s, it was top of the line, but now it's not even comparable anymore. If you moor your, say, Catalina 42 Mark II next to an older salt on a Passport 40, there's a good chance that they'll kind of turn their nose up at you a little bit because your bleach bottle boat is just too roomy and too fancy and too much bang for your sailboat buck. So surely she would never last a day in a force 7 gale offshore. And no, maybe she wouldn't, but luckily your Catalina is much faster than the Passport. It has better weather and sea condition information coming in and available because of newer technology, so you're probably not going to be out in a 4.7 anyway. Do you need an encapsulated keel? Are you okay with a bolt-on? Let me know in the comments. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make these videos possible. A big shout out to all the patrons that have gotten us this far. If you'd like to help out the channel, please consider becoming a patron. Next up on our list, Ketch Rigs. This is where you have 2 masts. And I've heard a lot of people say that a ketch is better for single-handed sailing or short-handed sailing. And they'll only look at ketches because they read that on the internet somewhere. And it kind of threw me for a loop. Having a whole extra mast, set of rigging, and a whole extra set of sails, that's easier? Technically, yes and no. It can be easier, but then it cannot be easier. A normal single-mast sloop is fairly easy to get it up and running, get all the sails up in a fairly short amount of time, especially if it has a furling jib and a furling mainsail. But with the mast at the relatively center part of the boat, fore and aft, the center of effort is in the middle of the boat, making the boat hard to balance. Think about it turning left and right. If you have one sail a little too tight, the boat's going to go that way. If the main's a little too tight, the boat's going to go that way. It's hard to get that balance when you only have one mast and the center of effort is a pivot point right in the middle of the boat. So adding a second mast aft of the first mast actually solves the problem. It changes the center of effort from a pinpoint to actually like a large line down the middle of the boat. So fore and aft, the boat's much more likely to balance out if you get the sails trimmed even remotely right. Now that second mast, we call it a mizzen mast, and it has a mizzen main and sometimes even a spinnaker, which is super cool. But if you can get the boat almost balanced on the main mast with the mainsail and the jib, and then you add the mizzen, you can balance the boat out really easily. And some people actually just steer the boat on long passages by adjusting the mizzen trim. You just lock the wheel and use the mizzen to keep the boat straight. It's pretty cool and way easier if you're single-handed. Having that extra sail plan too means more speed over passages, so you might take a 16-hour day down to a 15 or a 14-hour day, or on super long ocean passages you might even shave days off your time at sea, which is safer. Faster is always better. Now it all sounds very nice, especially when you're short-handed, but it does come with some obvious downsides. It introduces the added complexity of a whole second mast with a whole second set of rigging in at least one extra sail. It also means less room generally in the cockpit area where that mast is probably going to live, and a whole lot more trimming of sails whenever you go sailing. That might get annoying. Food for thought to consider if you insist on a Ketch rig and you've painted yourself into that corner of this is what I'm going to buy. A standard sloop rig may be harder to balance the boat out on your longer passages, thus requiring more effort to actually sail the boat. And that can be annoying, but it will make you a better sail trimmer in the long run. And the Ketches may have made complete sense in their heyday, but that was decades ago and things are a little bit different now. Modern technology has given us tremendously good hydraulic autopilots that will hold a line much better than they used to. We also now have battery technology that is far beyond what we used to have, so that an autopilot can run for days and days on end if you needed to, which is very helpful if you're short-handed. And solar and wind power generation is now just commonplace. Everybody has it on every cruising boat. So feeding that autopilot's energy needs is now not even an afterthought in your power budget. We didn't have any of that stuff when Ketches were super popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, there is no doubt that a Ketch at full canvas rocketing by is an extremely beautiful thing. It is quintessential romance of sailing stuff, the things you take pictures of. It just might not be as necessary as you think it is to have one. And for the added complexity, it might not be worth the drawbacks with cost of ownership when it comes time to replace the rigging or the sails, and cost of the deck layout. One last thing to consider that might be a mistake when you're boat shopping, and this one I know firsthand and I'm a firm believer in. Some folks insist on an ocean-going world traveler because maybe they want to start on the East Coast where a lot of people start, and do the Bahamas to sort of get their feet wet, and then continue on to the rest of the Caribbean, and then cross the Atlantic and do the Med for a few years. Some pretty lofty and admirable goals, and I hear a lot of them from folks who are just getting started in their cruising career, but food for thought. From many people who have done this, who are out there cruising and doing it right now, a big ocean crosser would be required to go all of those places, but you might not end up doing that. Cruising plans always change with the tide, and having been out there, I can tell you firsthand, the world is a very, very big place. And I figured on rocketing down the East Coast to get to the Bahamas as quickly as possible, but I got swept up in the beauty of it all, of all the people I met, of the amazing places that I ended up just on the East Coast, and I very, very quickly became happy. Places like Annapolis or St. Augustine, very hard to leave. After the East Coast, you land yourself in the Bahamas, and by then, probably with a bunch of like-minded cruisers on other boats, and you find yourself slowing down a lot. Island time starts to take over, and those lofty goals start to go by the wayside because you find that you're just very, very happy. After the Bahamas, you're off to the rest of the Caribbean, and now you're traveling with some buddy boats full of people that you're absolutely fallen in love with, and you really don't want to cruise without them anymore. They're part of your life now. They're your neighbors, your family, and you meet locals on the islands, and you become fast friends. Relationships develop, and all of a sudden your goal of ending up in the Med within 2 years is like a distant memory, and you can't imagine rushing through the world at such a fast pace anymore when all you were looking for in the first place was the freedom of cruising and in beautiful places with beautiful people, and you sort of come to regret buying the boat that you bought. For example, you could have focused on less of an ocean-going cruiser and more on comfort and livability, maybe gone a lot cheaper, and used the extra cash for things that you're using a lot now, like bigger solar panels or a bigger freezer to keep all the mahi you've been catching. You could have gone for something a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit smaller to keep your maintenance costs down, and something with a bit shallower draft so that you can get into places a little bit better. My point is, plans change, and once you're out there doing this thing, you're just going to find happiness was a lot closer than you thought it was. That's it for this week, guys. If you want to chat with other sailors, we have a great community over on the Lady K Discord channel. I'll leave a link in the description. And if you need help boat shopping, of course, I dedicated a page over at ladyksailing.com where you can request to book an hour of my time so we can chat. Head on over to ladyksailing.com/consults. Until next week, guys, keep the heavy side down, but not too far down.